The sun hadn't yet risen over the flat expanse of West Texas when the convoy rolled in. November 1943. Camp Swift, near Bastrop, 40 miles east of Austin. The trucks carried men who'd crossed an ocean in chains, German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps. Young men who'd survived the desert only to surrender under the relentless Allied advance. Now they were here, in a land so foreign it might as well have been another planet. The ranch foreman stood at the fence line, watching the dust cloud approach. His name was Clayton Worth, 52 years old, leathered skin, hands that had worked cattle for 3 decades. He'd been asked, no ordered by the War Department, to house 20 of these prisoners on his property. Labor shortage. The war had taken every able-bodied man between 18 and 35. The ranches were dying. The cotton fields sat unpicked. The government had a solution: use the enemy. Clayton spat into the dirt. He'd lost his nephew at Anzio 6 months prior. Tommy, 23 years old. Never made it off the beach. Now Clayton was supposed to feed and shelter the same bastards who'd been shooting at American boys. The truck stopped. Soldiers jumped out first. American MPs, rifles ready. They opened the back gates and the Germans emerged, blinking against the early light. They wore faded uniforms with PW stenciled in white paint across their backs. Prisoner of war. Some were young, 18, maybe 19. Others looked older, harder. Officers maybe, or career soldiers. They lined up in silence. Clayton noticed their faces. Exhaustion, confusion, fear. One of the MPs, a sergeant from Oklahoma, walked over to Clayton. These 20 are yours for the next 6 months. Work detail, fencing, cattle, whatever you need. They're to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. 3 meals a day. Humane conditions. No abuse. Clayton didn't respond. The sergeant lowered his voice. I know this ain't easy, but we're all stuck with it. Clayton nodded once. The Germans were led to the old bunkhouse, a structure that hadn't been used since the Depression. It smelled of dust and dry wood. 16 cots. A wood stove, no luxury, but it was shelter. Clayton watched them file inside. One of them, a tall man with blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, looked back at him. Their eyes met. The German didn't look away. Neither did Clayton. The door closed. The first week was silence. The prisoners worked. They mended fences. They hauled feed. They mucked stalls. They didn't complain. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They moved like ghosts through the ranch, trying to be invisible. Clayton's wife, Margaret, managed the kitchen. She was a stout woman with silver hair and a voice that could carry across 3 acres. She'd been feeding ranch hands for 30 years. Now she was feeding the enemy. She hated it. Every morning she cooked oatmeal, bland, efficient, the minimum required. At lunch, beans and cornbread. At dinner, stew, mostly water and potato. She followed the rules. She gave them what they needed to survive, nothing more. The Germans ate in silence. Clayton watched them sometimes from the porch. They sat on benches outside the bunkhouse, tin plates in their laps. They ate slowly, methodically. No one smiled. No one laughed. One evening, Margaret came out and stood beside him. They look like boys, she said quietly. Clayton didn't answer. Tommy's age, she added. He turned and went inside. 3 weeks in, one of the prisoners collapsed in the field. His name was Friedrich, 19 years old, from a village near Munich. He'd been assigned to dig post holes along the north pasture. It was hard work. The Texas soil was rock and clay. By mid-afternoon, Friedrich dropped his shovel and fell to his knees. The other prisoners rushed to him. Clayton rode over on horseback. Friedrich was pale, shaking. His hands were blistered and bleeding. He looked up at Clayton with wide, terrified eyes. Bitter, he whispered. Please. Clayton dismounted. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to the boy. Friedrich drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. The other Germans watched, waiting to see what Clayton would do. He could have sent Friedrich back to work. The rules allowed it. Prisoners were expected to work unless injured or ill. Friedrich was just tired, just weak. But Clayton saw something else. He saw Tommy. He saw his nephew, 23 years old, collapsing on a beach in Italy, alone, scared, dying in the sand. Clayton turned to the others. Get him back to the bunkhouse. Let him rest. They stared at him, unsure if they'd understood. Clayton pointed toward the bunkhouse. Go! They lifted Friedrich and carried him away. That night, Margaret made extra stew. She didn't say why. She just cooked. She added more beef than usual. More carrots, more seasoning. When the prisoners lined up for dinner, she filled their bowls higher than before. The tall German with blonde hair, his name was Hans, stepped forward to accept his bowl. He looked at the food, then at Margaret. Danke, he said softly. Thank you. Margaret didn't respond. She just moved to the next man, but something had shifted. December came. The mornings turned cold. Frost covered the fields. The prisoners wore thin jackets, inadequate for the Texas winter. Margaret saw them shivering as they worked. One morning, she went into the attic and pulled out old coats that had belonged to ranch hands from years past. She brought them down and left them on the porch. When the prisoners came for breakfast, they found the coats. They looked at each other, confused. Hans picked one up. He turned it over in his hands, checking for some trick, some condition. There was none. He put it on. The others followed. Clayton started giving them Sundays off. The Geneva Convention required 1 day of rest per week, but most ranchers ignored it. Work didn't stop for war, but Clayton honored it. Every Sunday the prisoners were free. They played cards. They wrote letters home. They carved small wooden figures from scrap wood. One Sunday, Clayton walked past the bunkhouse and heard singing. He stopped. The sound was faint, but clear. German voices harmonizing. A hymn, maybe. Or a folk song. He didn't know. But it was beautiful. He stood there listening. Margaret appeared beside him. They're just boys, she said again. This time, Clayton nodded. Christmas approached. Margaret had an idea. She didn't tell Clayton at first. She knew he'd resist. But the thought had taken root in her mind and wouldn't let go. These men, these boys, were thousands of miles from home. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also sons, brothers, husbands maybe, and it was Christmas. She went into town and bought what she could with ration coupons, sugar, flour, a small ham, and bacon. Real bacon, thick-cut, smoked, expensive. She planned a Christmas breakfast when Clayton found out he was silent for a long time. Why? He finally asked. Because it's right, Margaret said simply. Clayton looked at her. She'd been his partner for 28 years. She'd buried a child with him. She'd survived droughts and depressions. She'd never once asked him for something he couldn't give. He nodded. Christmas morning, 1943. The sky was clear. The air was cold and sharp. The prisoners woke early, as they always did. They dressed and walked to the main house, expecting the usual oatmeal and weak coffee. Instead, they smelled bacon. They stopped. The scent was unmistakable, rich, smoky, overwhelming. Hans, the tall blonde German, looked at the others. No one moved. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Come on in, she said. Breakfast is ready. They hesitated. Clayton stepped out behind her. You heard her. Get inside. They filed in slowly, unsure. The dining room had been set with plates and forks. Real plates, not tin. The table was covered with food. The prisoners
Scrambled
stood
eggs,
frozen.
biscuits, fresh butter,
One of the
jam,
younger
and bacon.
ones, a boy named Otto,
Piles
started
of it,
to cry.
crispy, golden,
He
still
covered his
sizzling.
face with his hands, but his shoulders shook. The others looked away, embarrassed. But then another started, and another. Hans stood rigid, fighting to control himself. But when he looked at the bacon, something broke inside him. He thought of his mother. His kitchen. Christmas mornings before the war. The smell of food. The sound of laughter. The feeling of home. He sat down and wept. Soon all 20 of them were crying, not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet, helpless tears. The kind that come when a man realizes how far he's fallen, how much he's lost, how desperately he wants to go home. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. Clayton looked at the floor. No one spoke. For 5 minutes. The only sound was the quiet weeping of 20 men who'd been soldiers, who'd been enemies, but who were now just broken boys sitting at a table in Texas. Finally, Hans wiped his eyes. He looked at Margaret, then at Clayton. Warum? He asked. Why? Margaret stepped forward. Because you're far from home, she said. And so is my nephew. Hans didn't understand all the words, but he understood the tone. He stood and bowed his head. Danke, vielen Dank, thank you. Thank you so much. Clayton nodded once. Sit down and eat, they did. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. The bacon was gone in minutes. They ate the eggs, the biscuits. They drank coffee and asked for more. Margaret kept refilling their plates. For the first time since they'd arrived, they smiled. They talked to each other in German, their voices light, almost happy. They laughed at small jokes. They passed food back and forth. They acted for one brief hour like human beings again. Clayton sat at the head of the table, saying nothing, but he watched them and he thought of Tommy. After breakfast, the prisoners stood and began clearing the table. Margaret tried to stop them, but they insisted. They washed every dish. They swept the floor. They wiped down the table until it gleamed. When they were done, Hans approached Clayton. He extended his hand. Clayton looked at it, then he shook it. The war went on. The prisoners worked through winter into spring. They repaired the ranch. They tended the cattle. They became part of the rhythm of the place. In April, Hans received a letter. His village had been bombed. His mother was dead. His younger brother was missing. He read the letter alone. Outside the bunkhouse, Margaret found him there. Staring at the horizon, she sat beside him and didn't say anything. After a while, Hans spoke. "I fight for Germany. I kill for Germany. But Germany is gone now." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "You'll go home someday," she said. "And you'll rebuild." Hans shook his head. "Nothing to rebuild." Margaret stood. "There's always something to rebuild." In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the bunkhouse and listened to the broadcast. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. They sat in silence. Some cried. Some stared at the floor. Some looked relieved. Hans turned off the radio. "It's over," he said quietly. But none of them felt victorious. The prisoners remained on the ranch for another year. Repatriation took time. There were millions of displaced people. Camps overflowing. Countries in ruins. The process was slow. Clayton didn't complain. The prisoners had become part of the ranch. They knew the work. They knew the land. And they were no longer enemies. They were just men. In the summer of 1946, the orders finally came. The prisoners were to be sent back to Germany. Margaret cried when she heard. Clayton said nothing, but he stopped eating for 2 days. The morning they left, the prisoners lined up outside the bunkhouse. They wore the same faded uniforms they'd arrived in. Their faces were older now, weathered, changed. Hans stepped forward. He looked at Clayton. "You saved my life," he said in broken English. "Not just food, not just work. You give me," he searched for the word, "hope." Clayton's jaw tightened. "You take care of yourself, son." Hans nodded. Margaret hugged him. She hugged all of them. She pressed small cloth bundles into their hands. Food for the journey. Biscuits and jerky. The trucks arrived. The prisoners climbed in. As the convoy pulled away, Clayton stood at the fence line, watching the dust cloud recede. Margaret stood beside him. "You did a good thing," she said. Clayton shook his head. "I just fed them breakfast," Margaret smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Years later, in 1953, Clayton received a letter. It was from Germany. From Hans, the letter was short, written in careful English. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Worth, I am home. My village is small again, but we are rebuilding. I have married. I have a son. His name is Clayton. I think of you often. I think of the morning you gave us bacon. I think of the kindness you showed when you did not have to. You taught me that enemies can become brothers. That mercy is stronger than hate. That humanity survives even in war. I will tell my son about you. I will tell him about Texas. I will tell him that once, when I was lost, a man and his wife gave me hope. Thank you." Hans Clayton read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. He never spoke of it, but every Christmas morning, for the rest of his life, Margaret cooked bacon, and Clayton always said the same thing: "Smells like home." The ranch still stands. The bunkhouse is gone now, reclaimed by time and weather. But the main house remains, the kitchen where Margaret cooked that Christmas breakfast, the porch where Clayton stood and watched 20 broken men become human again. The land remembers. And somewhere in Germany, an old man named Hans tells his grandchildren about a ranch in Texas, about a man who shook his hand, about a woman who gave him bacon, and about the morning he learned that kindness, even in the smallest gesture, can save a life. Because sometimes mercy isn't about grand declarations or sweeping policy. Sometimes it's just breakfast, a hot meal, a moment of grace, a reminder that even in war, even across enemy lines, we are all just people trying to find our way home. And on that cold Christmas morning in 1943, 20 German prisoners sat at a table in Texas and remembered what it felt like to be human. They wept, they ate, they were seen. And in that moment, the war didn't matter. All that mattered was the bacon, the warmth, and the impossible kindness of strangers who chose to see men instead of monsters. That day, Clayton Worth didn't defeat an enemy. He fed a neighbor, and that made all the difference.